No matter what your political views are, you have almost surely had some conversations with your peers these past few years, which have included statements like, how can they think that way? How can they not see how bad that candidate is? This is Chuck Camerata for Next 2.0, and my political views are distinctly progressive. And for years, my friends and I would have those kinds of conversations and say those kinds of things about Donald Trump and people on the right wing. But along the way, I realized I can't just write off everybody who disagrees with me. So I began trying to understand. I started engaging more often with people on the right, and rather than arguing with them, I decided to listen and understand. And a funny thing happened. I heard them saying those same things about people like me and the people I vote for. How can you not see how bad this candidate is? On the program today with Marcus and me is Dr. Jeff Bloodworth. Jeff is a history professor at Gannon University. He teaches modern American political history and genocide studies, and his recent article in the Erie Reader gave me a window into understanding rural Americans who support Trump and the political right. Jeff's particular insights into rural America and Trumpism is a result of his growing up in rural Mississippi, Alabama, and the Ozarks. He has lots of family still in those places where despair drips from people's lives, where deaths of despair, defined as deaths related to drug overdoses, alcohol-related diseases, and suicides, are so prevalent that they've caused the life expectancy rates nationwide to decrease for the first time in American history. He says in his article, which you should find and read, that Trumpism lies at the intersection of deaths of despair and the white working class. The thing that struck me about Jeff's writings, and you will hear it in the interview, is the compassion and respect with which he sees those whose politics he completely disagrees with. You will find a link to the article in the Erie Reader in the show notes. So here now is our conversation with Jeff Bloodworth.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Chuck. Hello and welcome to Next 2.0 on WQLN PBS NPR. Next is produced by the Public's Voice Media. I am your host, Marcus Atkinson, and of course, I have one of my guest hosts, Chuck Camerata, with me in studio today. If you want to know more about Next 2.0, you can go to Facebook and like the page. You can also follow us on Instagram at Next 2.0 Erie. There you can keep up with upcoming show promos, events, and clips about what's next for our communities and our democracy. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've got a special guest in the studio today, but let me just say this at the outset. We have done the impossible. Chuck has bought me such a rare find. Forget what you heard about the Impossible Burger. Forget what you know about tofu, all of these things, cloning, all of these things that make you say, you gotta be joking. That can't be possible. And what is that impossible thing Chuck has brought me? An article that actually explains with logic and understanding why normal folk, everyday folk, would vote for Donald Trump. And I sat down, Chuck told me about this because what many of you don't know, we sit down once a month, I want to say, and we meet at Brouhaha,
Have some coffee.
We meet at Brouhaha, we have a coffee, we solve all the world's problems. I would advise the Biden administration, Trump's handlers, send both your candidates to Brouhaha when we're there. We literally solve all the world's problems. The world is a better place when we leave that place, and it goes to hell right after the fact. We don't know what happens because we solve it all
We did.
in that hour.
Yeah.
But then it all just goes back to hell in a handbasket. And he tells me about this article in the Erie Reader. And we've gone back and forth about Trump and the voters. And as much as I like to clown President Trump, I have made points in our conversations about, listen, I get X, Y, and Z. I don't like him, but I get X, Y, and Z. And I've often said in some of these discussions, the Democrats have to get it together because he's playing on some weaknesses that exist. Whether he means it personally or he's doing it for political expediency, he's making a connection that's making people say, I don't like him, but I'm sick of the way things are going.
Yeah.
But I've never had it articulated, right? And so enter this article by our esteemed guest today, Professor Jeff Bloodworthy, who is a professor and journalist, and I'll let him unpack to whatever extent. First of all, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
All right. And before I let him have at it, I just want to give you the name of this article. It was an Erie Reader, and it was called "The Democratic Abandonment of Working Class Americans, How Quote-Unquote Deaths of Despair Are Driving Trumpism." And if you haven't read this yet, it is in the May 2024 edition of the Erie Reader, volume 14, number 5. It's got the frogs on the cover. You got to read this thing because it actually helps me, helped me anyways, understand what in the world is going on here.
Yeah, that's
right.
The kind of writing that Jeff did in that article is the kind of stuff that brings together things. I got a piece here, a piece there in my head.
Yeah.
And he brings it together, articulates something that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So that's why I love the article and wanted to talk to him on the program.
Yeah. And so, Jeff, let's go back a little bit because you are a Tennessean, right? And was it Memphis that you're from?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Memphis, Tennessee. And I saw your TED Talk, right? And I'm listening to you, and I'm like, here's a guy that cares about stuff. Here's a guy that looks at the world and says, what's going on with that? You know, what's in that person's mind during that? You know, and so unpack your background and how you got to this place, because being from the South, there's a lot going on down there, right?
Without a doubt. I'm not your garden variety academic. Most academics come from upper middle class backgrounds, right?
Which you pointed out in the TED Talk, because your father was dying from alcoholism, drinking Listerine, which I've had relatives who've done that cough syrup, because they were addicted to alcohol. Go ahead.
Yeah. So both sides of my family from rural Mississippi, all the typical stories of kind of growing up in the rural South. I grew up in Memphis, Birmingham, and moved to the Ozarks. So I've red roots, but I have a blue life. I think when I was 17 years old, I was brought up in a very conservative Republican household by my mom and my grandparents, who were Southern Baptists, but they walked the walk, right? And which is, we all know in our faith journeys, there are people who say things, and then there are people who do things. So I was very lucky in that way. But I think when I was 17, I saw a speech by Jesse Jackson at the 1988 Democratic Convention. I saw that on TV, and it was the not the coat of many colors. But it was based on that, about his grandmother knitting this wonderful blanket out of different mosaics, and he used that as a metaphor of America. And that is the moment in which I became a Democrat. And I think I was the only Democrat I'd ever met at that time when I was 17 years old. My dad is an alcoholic. I grew up. He beat my mother. She had the bravery in 1980 in Alabama to leave him, which was a very hard thing for Southern Baptist women to do at that time.
Yes.
She worked 2 jobs. I grew up in a majority minority low-income neighborhood in Memphis. I've had I would not trade my life for anything. I wish my mother didn't have to endure the things that she did. But my life and what I've seen through my personal experiences have, I think made me able to connect to a lot of people who kind of on the surface are different from me, right? I'm a middle class white guy now, but I had a really hard scrabble, odd upbringing. And I didn't have to read a book when I was 18 about sort of systemic racism. I saw it when I was growing up in that neighborhood. Yeah. There's the difference between book learning, which is really good.
That's right.
And what's in your gut.
That's right.
And I didn't have to become a feminist when I was in college, because so many young men who were raised by single moms, right, were feminists before we know that word, right? That's my basic story. And I went to college and I was like, well, what happened to American liberalism? Because I grew up in the age of Reagan. And I've devoted my life to writing about the demise of American liberalism, right? And the self-inflicted wounds that liberals inflict upon themselves that have alienated liberals from mainstream America. And then about 15 months ago, my best friend from high school, he died a death of despair. It was really tragic and sad. I expected it. And what it did is it jolted me out of my academic ivory tower. And I'm like, I'm tired of writing articles that 28 people read. I still do that. But what I do now is public-facing work because I'm writing a biography, former Speaker of the House from rural Oklahoma, and it's about sort of like liberalism doesn't just belong. Liberalism was born in rural America, by the way, not urban America. And but what I'm dedicated myself to doing is to try to understand these profound political and social divisions in America. And I've become remarkably less partisan and ideological in the past 10 years.
Right.
And I think that's how we heal the breach. That's how we heal the divide. We have got to quit seeing one another as our enemies. So I appreciate you having me on here, because this is now my life's work. Is about taking what I learn in writing my academic work, but taking that out to the public and writing in an engaging way so that I can touch as many lives as possible. And I've decided I want to do that in Erie. So that's right, why I write for the Erie Reader.
Amen.
Because I want to do that for Erie. And I write for national sites, and that's great and it's wonderful, right? But, I'm interested in making the small little ripples of positive change.
Yeah. Excellent. And it almost sounds like he's been sitting in on our conversations.
He has, yeah.
And I want to make sure that I come correct here, and that's Jeff Bloodworth. I don't know if I said Jeff Bloodworthy. I want to make sure I'm correct here. But Chuck, talk a little bit about what made this article land on how and why it landed on your spirit so profoundly, because I know that this is a president that you are just completely opposed to, right? And at the same time, you're an open-minded man. What is it about this article that resonated with you, that motivated you? Because it was Chuck that brought this interview together. What made you want to do this?
I think one of the things that's kind of my passion is, so it's really interesting to hear you talk about the last year or two of your work being more public facing, is helping people to do what needs to be done to heal the breach or the breaches. And that's really kind of what, for me, was the takeaway from your article. That you talk in the article about how people in rural America feel like the Democratic Party has abandoned them. And there's things to talk about there, but the important thing is that's the sense, that's the feeling that people have in large swathes of rural America. But what I took from that is that there is, and you talk a lot about this in the article, there is this breach today, this divide between rural and urban America. And maybe one of many divides, but a pretty fundamental divide in our culture today. And how does that sort of embrace of, or not embrace of, but reality of this breach and the sense in rural America that Democrats have abandoned them? I can see all of that. What I can't see, what I really struggle with is, how does Trump become their guy? How do they go from that to embracing Donald Trump? And I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but
I think the simple, cheeky answer is any port in a storm. My first book, right, it was about the history of the Democratic Party in the 60s and the 70s. And that's when urban Democrats overtook the Democratic Party and really had, the demographic upper hand. And what we've seen over the past 60 years is a Democratic Party that is not just overtaken by urban Democrats, but highly educated urban Democrats, people like me.
Yeah.
Not
entirely like you, but
of my particular pedigree, because I'm an apostate in many ways in the professoriate world. I befuddle many professors because they can't easily categorize me.
Right.
But the Democratic Party intentionally, this is the thing we don't realize, intentionally turned their back on rural America. And not just, it's a rural-urban divide, and it's also a class divide, right? And it's both at the same time. And, the Democratic Party, which used to be the party of the working man and working woman, has become the party of the highly educated urbanites, the winners of this globalized economy. Look, I am one of the winners. I grew up poor, and I pinch myself every day, and I'm like, I don't hyperventilate about money. That's a really weird feeling for me. I'm a winner in this globalized, information economy. And that's who the Democrats represent, and they've turned their back on work. I mean, they think they represent working class people, and in some ways their policies do. But working class people no longer have a seat at the table, right? I mean, working class people no longer run for office as Democrats. I mean, if you look at the numbers of the campaign staffs, right, or Senate and congressional staffs, they're huge numbers are from elite universities.
I saw that in your article, yeah.
Where if the Democrats want to be the party of the working class, where are the working class people? And this is the thing about about Trump. It's not just the white working class that's moving towards him. It's African American men are moving towards him. Latino. I mean, so it's a rural-urban divide, and it's a class divide, and we're seeing and Trump, at least. I mean, where are Trump's rallies? He goes to these places where Democrats no longer go to. And I wrote a different story in a different journal or newspaper, and I interviewed a huge number of Democratic strategists. And I wrote an iteration of it for the Erie Reader the month before. And these liberal strategists are telling me, and on the record, they're like, yeah, Democrats don't even try and rule America. So any port in a storm, Donald Trump at least talks to them.
Right.
And Democrats have stopped.
Right. It's the "what have you done for me lately" line that I've used when it comes to the Democrats in the African American community. I remember when Hillary was running. I lived in Atlanta, and I've had partners of mine in Atlanta. I was in politics in Atlanta, political operative, on multiple teams. And some of those political friends were like, "Listen, Hillary's not coming to ATL, the Black Mecca, because she assumes we're gonna vote for her because of Bill." Right? There's a lot of taken for granted that was going on. And of course, we see how that worked out. But I watched a documentary the other day, and it was about this guy who started these wilderness camps. It's very good. And he was giving these kids tough love, taking them out in the wilderness. They're starving to death. A couple of them died on his watch. He gets sued. He gets exonerated. And instead of going into another line of work, because it almost broke his family financially, he decides to keep doing it. It was some sort of compulsion at work. But in any event, his own 2 children became drug addicted while he was out punishing other kids for their decisions, one of which is in jail to this very day, his son. I say all that to say this: America for a long time has struck me as that country that is so high on their horse, they are so busy preaching from their podium and from their pulpit that they forget their own are in despair, right? You are so busy preaching to everybody else. You are so busy telling other people what their democracy should be, what they shouldn't be, who's a tyrant, who does, and your own are dying on your watch. This article made me feel, I'm like, you know what? He put voice to it. This is one of the things that Trump has been able to take advantage of, right?
Without a doubt. And this, I mean, there's a reason why, working class whites, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, right, are moving towards Trump, because at least he speaks to the anger and the bitterness of working class folk who have been left behind.
He's on it.
And sometimes I feel like I'm from the rural South, right? I mean, you can imagine the family members that I have growing up and hearing about race. They were not the most progressive people.
I'm sure.
But what I feel like is that the Democratic Party in many ways is still living in the 1970s and still thinking about our divides as primarily racial. And there are racial divides. I live in Erie, Pennsylvania.
Absolutely.
I know this is the most segregated city I've ever lived in.
Marcus has said this before. You hear our guest now. This is a white man who's a professor in college. It is not me. This is not hyperbole. But go ahead.
You said that? Yeah.
Oh my God.
I say that all the. I'm from the South. I'm used to interacting and meeting and seeing non-white people. I live on 2nd Street. Part of why I love it is because it's economically and racially diverse. Yep. Don't get me started on that.
Yeah, we could go a long way on that. We had a guest on the show who we loved, Pastor Alicia Jones, who left town because she had lived all around in the South and then came here, and she was a young black pastor, and she said, I can't find black professionals here. There's no black doctors, no black lawyers. And said, it's much more, the racism in the South is different, but I can live there. I have a community there. Here, I feel much more isolated. And so she went back to Memphis. Makes perfect sense. Fits right in with what you two were saying.
Yeah, great city. With its very, very, scarred racial past, but very telling. We don't talk enough about class in America.
Right.
I mean, that's the drum I'm probably going to beat for the rest of my life.
You got it.
And I feel it every day as a professor. Like, working class professors, we can almost smell one another. Right? Like it'd be, like I've become, that's who I'm really close friends with, or other professors who come from working class backgrounds, because, race matters. The Cornell West book of the 1990s, Race Matters. I mean, that was a seminal book for me. But I think there needs to be another book that says class matters.
Yeah.
And we do not talk enough about, this is what the Democratic Party's given up on. This is why the Democratic Party, they won an election, but they cannot build an enduring majority in order to pass legislation that will make real differences in the lives of working class people. And why? Because they don't talk about class, because everybody who runs the party at the national level, they all come from the same highly educated backgrounds.
Can I quote you before, as you go on with that? Because you pointed out something in this article that really blew my mind. We celebrate the Ketanji Brown Jacksons, right? The Sonia Sotomayors, and sometimes the Clarence Thomases. But we celebrate these folks. But you point out, in terms of classism, every single judge on the Supreme Court went to Harvard or Yale. Isn't that something?
It is. Someone did correct me. Amy Coney Barrett went to Notre Dame. The point still stands. This for a decade I've been like pounding this drum. If we talk about the Supreme Court in class, and I'm like, what about a state school? Isn't there a really bright young jurist who went to a really good state school who brings a particular perspective with them, right? Because we all know, how do you get into Harvard or Yale? Like, you're born upper middle class.
Legacy.
Yeah, I mean that it is as simple as that, and it is so incredibly class stratified. Now, my wife and I were both professors, right? And so her daughter, my stepdaughter, she's able to go to a great fancy school in Philadelphia, and she's, and I'm happy for her. But that's how it works. Why is she at Drexel doing this wonderful architecture degree? Well, her stepdad and mom are both professors. And like me, I dropped out of high school. I had no idea what I was doing with my life. And I'm the luckiest person in the world. I pinch myself every day, but I also know that where I went to graduate school, the kinds of universities that would then hire me, that was all predetermined by the station in which I was born. Now, I'm not complaining, but working class Americans know this. I mean, my mom had 2 jobs. She was a janitor. She's 80 years old. She can barely walk, right, because of how hard she worked with her hands. Yeah. And I understand the bitterness and anger of working class Americans, because I've had 6 of my close relatives die deaths of despair.
Yeah.
This is what's going on, white, black, and brown working class communities, right?
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you hear voices in the background, this is we're live at the studios of the Public's Voice on a parade street, and there's action going on in the backdrop. That's what it's all about. This summer, you'll hear a lot of background noise. Get used to it, because we'll be on location a lot. And so, Chuck, I'm going to throw this to you. I want you to think about something, though, because in this article also, 2015 Pew survey says 89% of Americans term themselves middle class, quote unquote. I want you, in your whatever point you're going to make, also take a wag at what you think middle class is nowadays, and we'll throw it back over to Professor Jeff to see what he thinks, because that term, people don't know where the line begins and ends nowadays on that term.
Yeah, do you draw that line economically, or with income, or do you have to own a house? What makes you middle class? I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, but I do really resonate with the conversation about class. I have a granddaughter who's in college, and she and I talk about stuff all the time. And one of the things that she's been talking about for several years, since she was a high school student, is it's not just about race, or not about party, it's about class. So if it is about class, why would working class people embrace a party that has policies that do them damage, that are not, in fact, promoting the self-interest of the working person?
That is the billion-dollar question. I would begin with Donald Trump, just for instance, right? He's not the only conservative who appeals to working class people. Donald Trump talks to people in a language and a style that normal people can understand. Democrats always pretend they're smarter than they are, and Republicans always pretend they're dumber than they are. And 35% of Americans have a 4-year college degree, right? You do the math.
Yeah.
So Donald Trump speaks to their bitterness, but Donald Trump also speaks to them. He speaks in a way where people don't feel dumb or spoken down to. I mean, I think of Bill Clinton, even Barack Obama, right? They were able to talk to normal humans, but Democrats, they don't have enough of those kinds of candidates, locally, statewide, nationally, because Democrats are the party of the highly educated.
Right.
And we all live in our bubbles now, and Democrats don't know how to talk to people, right, who aren't highly educated. And so so your question, why do working class people vote for conservatives who have policies that don't serve their economic interests? I mean, they also have cultural interests, right? And I think the Democratic Party, as we've seen, the highly educated white liberals have taken positions on social issues in the last 10 years that are to the left of working class non-whites. And so it's both at the same time. If you want to appeal to working class people, you need to have working class people running for office. You need to have working class people on party central committees. You need to have working class people, at kind of every strata of your particular party. And Democrats, they just don't have any real sensibility of how out of touch they are with working class Americans.
I really think you hit on the magic of Bill Clinton, because you are so right. I remember when Bill Clinton was running for office, and the shtick was, and I believe it too, this was a guy that you could go into the bar and have a conversation with him, and he would not feel out of place.
Right.
I love going to the Tap House. A friend of mine owns the place I grew up with in high school. If I went to the Tap House and Bill Clinton, not knowing he was a politician, was sitting at the bar and we were having a conversation, he'd fit in. I'd be, what are you doing here? You feel like you don't fit here. No.
Yeah, exactly.
He felt like he fit. So I think you're hitting on something.
Yeah, you could play basketball with Barack Obama and have a conversation.
There you go.
So those people made connections. But I want to keep pushing on this just a little bit, because not only do the Republicans legislate in ways that are economically disadvantageous to the working person, but even on the cultural issues, we're finding that the right creates policy, law that does damage to women, for example, that does damage to the black population, for example, that is anti-immigration. And there's a whole series of things that go into talking about the positives and the negatives of immigration in this country. There may be an issue or two in which Republican policy suits working class people. But it's mostly, and this is the thing that I really want to get to, it's mostly because Republicans are really good at naming and and harnessing the bitterness and the anger and the depression of people in economically struggling communities. And so they're looking for places to lay the blame. They're looking for scapegoats. And we on the left have become really good at being that. We've allowed it to happen to us by ignoring their pain and their despair.
Right. And before I throw this to Jeff, let me piggyback off that a little bit, and playing off of identifying, codifying, whatever word you want to use for the Republicans doing what you just described. I say acknowledging the anger and the frustration.
Good point.
Right? It's we've talked about the gang member and the drug dealer, acknowledging the struggles of the young brother in the hood, and it's the educated brother who, you so busy talking above him. Yeah, when you get to this level, you can see it the way I see it, and not really acknowledging the struggles of that young man or that young woman right now. The drug dealer said, man, I get what you're going through.
Yeah.
And I don't have to say it in a whole bunch of flowery language.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I know you're trying to pay your bills. Run this to the corner, man. I got $50 for you.
Yeah.
You know there's something up.
Yeah.
But somebody's acknowledged your struggle and is trying to give you a lifeline, right? We'll deal with the negativity of it later. I feel like some of that is at play.
I think part of it, though, the acknowledgement part of it makes great sense to me. And I like the use of that word. I don't feel like maybe either party, but I don't feel like the right is particularly helping them to have a better life.
I'm not mad at
They
that.
are acknowledging.
I'm not mad about that.
They are acknowledging, but they are not doing anything that makes life better.
Ooh, this is good already. We only been in this 28 minutes. This is good. Go ahead, Jeff.
This is the work of my life, right? I mean, I started, academically, this is what I work on. I'm writing a book of a Speaker of the House. He was a liberal from rural Oklahoma, from Bug Tussle, Oklahoma, right? This is a region of Oklahoma that was called Little Dixie. And what is extraordinary is that I couldn't agree more. He grew up poor, and so he could always acknowledge, right, the pains and the struggle of working class. You can't fake that.
Right.
You just can't fake it. I mean, this is why Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and Franklin Roosevelt. Why was Franklin Roosevelt a magical politician? Polio. He, during his time in convalescence with polio, he came into contact with thousands of ordinary Americans, right? And he was able to empathize with their pain and their struggles. And a party of by and for the professional middle class, which is what the Democratic Party is. For most of my adult life, being a Democrat, being a liberal was central to my identity. That is no more. What Trumpism has done to me was the scale has fallen from my eyes, and I look at an ideology that I study professionally, and I understand why they lose and why, sadly, they deserve to lose. I mean, when most Americans are either lower middle class or working class, that's the majority of the vote. And if you have a party that has no connection to their struggles, right? I mean, of course you can't win. And they don't know what they don't know, and they're not interested in knowing what they don't know. And that's what's so, and I grew up working class. I grew up in the age of Reagan. My mother had to work 2 jobs because there weren't, somehow or another, we never qualified, or she was a hardworking woman. I think she just never bothered to apply for.
Got it.
Right? And I saw this with my own eyes. These are the neighborhoods I grew up in. My relatives who were dying, right, because of this pain and feeling of being left behind and forgotten. And this is a working class problem in America. I've never heard a national Democrat use the term deaths of despair.
I don't want to forget the question that I put out there a second ago, because I genuinely want an answer to it. To the best of your knowledge, working class, middle class, upper middle, to the best of your knowledge, where are these lines drawn? What's that rubric look like? Because I think it was easier back in the days of my parents, right? Not so much today. What do you have to say on that?
How do we measure class in America?
Absolutely.
Right. I think these days we say college, non-college.
Got it.
Right. I mean, I think that is the class. That is the voting divide in America. That is the class divide in America.
Helpful.
Right. I mean, we could look at by income. You would say it's working classes between like the 30th percentile, right? And the 70th percentile of income earnings, if you wanted to look at it just as money. But I think it's deeper than that.
Yeah.
Class is about who went to college and who didn't. So you could be a working class person and make a good income, right? But there's and going to college doesn't make you a better person. It makes you a different person.
Yeah.
And I think that's the divide that that's the divide that we see in the 24 election. If you're college educated, you're voting for Biden. If you're not college educated, you're increasingly likely voting for Trump, even if you aren't white.
Interesting. Chuck, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know a lot. It's just everything's, I don't know.
This whole thing is frustrating you just a touch, isn't it?
I'm reading a book about the fact it's called dealing with doom or something like that. You and I had a conversation about on air a while back about the demise of American democracy.
Yeah.
And so the whole struggle for what does the future look like, and the fact that everything is being questioned today. And I don't have one of those big brains that can kind of sort through all kinds of things at one time. But I'm still struggling with the quality of thinking. And maybe it's not thinking. Maybe that's where I'm getting.
Maybe it's feeling.
I'm struggling with. I understand that we feel like Trump and the right acknowledges our pain. But I don't get from any of them. Do you watch Fox News and feel like those people empathize with the poor?
No.
No, you do not. Do you think Donald Trump does? Does it come across to you? So are we not able to see he doesn't empathize with the poor? He just seizes on what he knows how to use them and their anger and their frustration and their pain. But how do we help people? I don't even know if that's the right question I want to ask. How do we help people to see through that so that they're not just hearing stuff that speaks to their itching ears, to use a biblical phrase, but they're also able to evaluate people, parties, movements, ideas on a much more objective, truthful level.
Maya Angelou said people may forget what you said, they may forget what you did, but they'll never forget the way they made you feel. And I think that's at play deeper than what we want to acknowledge, man. It's the guy who talks himself out of it when he's beating up his girlfriend repeatedly. Well, he makes me feel this isn't good for you. But he said it's how you make me feel in those vulnerable moments that carries it, and it makes logic is not a part of analyzing this political cycle.
Yeah. Or human beings in general. I mean, in my sermon last Sunday, one of the things that I said to people was, let's just face it. Human beings are not rational beings.
No.
Human beings feel their way to their beliefs. And so I get all of that. But we're several cycles into this now. Did your mother experience the trickle down of economics to her? So we've been dealing with this, what really strikes me as being blatant bullshit since, we're not going to be on NPR with this, are we? Okay.
But this is when you know Chuck is upset.
of economic policy and even cultural wars that really don't deal with the realities of things. Donald Trump is not anti-abortion, except in as much as it serves his purposes.
He is not.
And I think that's probably true of many of the politicians on the right. But they're now having to go to extremes in fealty to Trump, and we're not asking ourselves, what the heck is going on with these crazy people? We're not even able to see that they're behaving in crazy ways. We just are like, hey, they speaking to me. And I'm going to be with them. We have, how do we disarm that? How do we, and I'm not just talking about on the right, because it's now happening on the left as well. But there's an orthodoxy that we just buy into and we go to that extreme. And so this is what you're talking about with the Democratic Party and the elitism. The idea that going to college makes you a better person is something that became ingrained in us a couple of generations back, and now we measure people that way. We measure ourselves that way. So how do we move beyond these ways of seeing each other, these stereotypes that push us into our silos or to our corners in these battles? Have you got any ideas on that one?
Good luck with this one, Jeff, but go ahead. We're listening.
That's another billion-dollar question. I can only speak for myself. And my attempts to not be a typical highly educated upper middle class person in my own work. That's why I do this journalism, is I talk to people and I learn from them. I have my preconceived notions, and I was like, well, why don't Democrats win in rural America? And I'm like, oh, well, people in rural America, white people in rural America, don't want to vote for Democrats. And then I started talking to people, and they're like, no, Jeff, that's not correct. Democrats don't try. right? I mean, that is the harsher. They don't try to win because the assumption is that those people don't want to vote for us. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton won half the rule vote.
Wow.
Right? Barack Obama in 2008, people forget, he had a whole rule strategy. Barack Obama went to rule Virginia, rule Ohio, rule Indiana, rule North Carolina, and he reduced the margins of defeat, right, in order to win those states. And so we all have to, and again, I get paid to do this, so it's easier for me, but we have to escape our cultural ghettos, right? I mean, that's we watch, you know, depending on your demographic, you watch particular TV shows, you listen to particular radio programs or particular podcasts, and we have to find a way to escape that and to see one another's kind of like, you know, like Americans are not as divided as we think we
Absolutely
are.
Exactly.
right.
Exactly.
Right?
That's why
agree on
you
that.
go into the barbershop makes great sense. And you went to the distillery, right? Or to the bar and doing things on site in places where we don't traditionally think of this is a place where we're going to have some interaction across our political differences.
Yeah.
And you got to go to those places. I'm the coffee shop guy. I go to coffee shops all around town. Jeff and I had a conversation at the coffee shop. Marcus and I do it at the coffee shop. And there's great conversations that happen at the coffee shop. But it's partly about having conversation and listening. And so if you're not present, as the point that you're making with Democrats, you can't be listening.
Yeah.
We interviewed Sister Simone Campbell on this program a while back.
Rock star.
Absolutely. And she talked about her experiences in rural America. So Sister Simone Campbell was the leader of the Nuns on the Bus movement. A lot of people don't know what that is, but it was a group of people back in 2006, 2006 or 7. They began traveling the country, talking to people about Catholic justice issues and the importance of voting. And they ended up doing it for 8 or 9 or 10 years in a row. And she got to meet all kinds of people. She goes to rural Texas. Woman comes in, says, oh, I know who you are, sister. I disagree with everything you stand for. And they spent the evening listening to each other and walked away having a better understanding. And Sister Simone says, it was a seminal moment for me. I learned that I'm not there just to lobby. I'm there to listen. And boy, do we have to do that. And I was really glad to see in your article that you talked about how Jim Wirtz is doing some of that.
Yeah, look, I'm unrelentingly critical of the National Democratic Party, but I also want to make it very clear is Joe Biden won Erie County in 2020. Why? Because a lot of the work that the Christy Ganibuses and the Jim Wirtzes of the Democratic Party here are doing. They're opening up field offices in rural Erie County. They're listening to people. There are Democrats out there, right? I mean, and I would say the same thing for Republicans coming back to urban America, right? We need to have parties that are racially and economically diverse again. But the Erie County Democratic Party should be a model for the rest of the nation. But I mean, Chuck Schumer said the quiet part out loud. He said this a couple of years ago. He's like, for every rural Western Pennsylvania vote that Democrats lose, they pick up 2 in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. The harsh truth is the National Democratic Party doesn't care about Erie. The National Democratic Party does not care about any place that isn't for the educated, highly educated urban elites. And that's a painful kind of admission, but when I finally kind of realized that, it's very freeing. Because it is just the reality of what it is. And this has been a long march. And I say this as someone, I write, professionally. I'm in the archives. I know the history of the Democratic Party since 1945. And I'm not basing this just on a few kind of interviews with random people. I have a deep understanding. And this is why Trump is the most unpopular politician in America, and Democrats struggle to beat him.
Right, with all the baggage he has going on right now on top of that.
If this were a baseball team and you can't beat a bad baseball team, what would you say about your team? I mean, it's not the other baseball team's fault. There has to be some sort of deep flaw within your baseball team. And that's where I think Democrats, and liberals, they don't look. It's always easier to point the finger and cast blame instead of looking in the mirror and seeing it for what it is.
Absolutely right. And that haunts us. Go ahead, Marcus.
It does. No. This reminds me of the time when Dr. King, amongst black folks, when his popularity plummeted to a great extent prior to his assassination, because the Poor People's Campaign was bringing in, it was shining the light on poverty of all races, all ethnicities, and black folk were like, hey, man, we got stuff of our own we're dealing with. We'll get to that. No, Dr. King, at the end, it was unveiled and unmasked that he was a human rights advocate, not necessarily just a champion of black folk. And there were a lot of black folk who didn't appreciate that once they found that out. But the point that I'm making is it's that adverse reaction to, what about them? What about them? We got our own stuff. No. Their stuff matters too. This is a human issue. And so you're touching on some of that. Parties forgetting about whole swaths of individuals for whatever reason.
And I talk to a lot of folks from churches and I talk to people in the coffee shops. One of the things that I hear from people all the time, people on the left by and large, is I don't understand why they can think this or how they can vote this way, or
ask them.
And that's the point. We don't understand, and in our lack of understanding, rather than look at ourselves and say, okay, what do we do to connect? We just write them off. They're stupid, they're ignorant, they're bad guys, they're racists, whatever we might label. And so now we're as bad at the labeling thing across the board than we've ever been. And it's just all about what category can I fit you into and write you off.
This interview for me is, listen, no offense, is the next best thing. The best thing, and we've talked about, I want the person that loves Trump and doesn't give a damn how you feel about it. I want them on the show, not to argue with them, not to cast aspersions. Please unpack from our audience. Just tell us where this is coming from. Do this. Articulate why you are in Trump's camp, period. Because I think, to Chuck's point, I don't want to just write these. It's to the point where you can't just write people, I support Trump, I'm writing. No, man, can we not all see that it's deeper than that? You can't just write people off because they vote for Trump. At first, it was easy to do. Now it's like, all right, man, we need to have a discussion because it's not that simple.
Yeah. Now, in 2016, what the left decided about Trump voters is they were racist.
Amen.
And look, Donald Trump. I think to call Donald Trump a racist is diminishing what his real kind of danger is. He's a nihilist. He doesn't care about anything. And that's even more dangerous.
It's so true.
And again,
so true.
If you think about Adolf Hitler, right? And I'm not comparing the two, but at least Adolf Hitler had a moral calculus. Like he didn't care about any other humans except Germanic people, right? I teach about the Holocaust and genocide, so I know a little bit about this. And there was a moral calculus, as perverted as it was. For Donald Trump, he doesn't even care about his own family members.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll notice at the trial, his family's not even showing up at the trial. And it was a complete misunderstanding of what the Trump vote was. I mean, if you talk to Trump voters, most of them understand his moral challenges, right? I mean, and they'll freely admit, that he's not exactly the kind of person they want their son or daughter to grow up to be. He's an expression of anger for many, not all. And 10% of Trump voters in 2016 were Obama voters in 2012. And, it is just too simple. I mean, but the Democrats have done this since the 1960s. When the white working class turned against the Democratic Party in the 1960s, what liberal elites, this is what historians generally do, is they say it was only a racial backlash. I'm from the South. I know it was a racial backlash. But it also had to do with inflation. It had to do with crime. It had to do with disorder. It had to do with the anti-Vietnam protesters. All of that is to say you're not saying that the white working class turned against Democrats. You're not saying it wasn't because of race. But you need to say it's more complicated than that, if that makes sense. And we reduce people then, and instead of being complicated and complex with having some flaws, right? And even some of them being racist, right? But it's more complicated. But it's very reductionist. Yeah. And this is what the left loves to do with Trump and his voters, is to somehow say, well, it's all this or all that. And they're three-dimensional human beings. And we have to talk to them.
So Chuck, I want to take a necessary detour, I believe. with this conversation because it struck me when, as you were
Don't ask
talking.
me something that's going to embarrass
No,
me.
no, no, no. You are uniquely qualified for me to at least pose this question to. When you look at how and why Hitler appealed to his population, and how and why Trump is appealing to his population, where are there, historically, in your opinion, legitimate similarities? Because people are drawing similarities just based on where are there legitimate historical similarities that you found, if you have found any, seeing that you've actually studied both of these?
He said that was for me, but it's for you, Jeff. It's a scholarly question in some ways.
I brought the H word into this, Hitler, and this is what you learn is when you start comparing people to Hitler and the Nazis, like you've kind of lost the narrative thread. But I will say this, that authoritarian movements rhyme, right? I mean, there are not Trump voters, right? But Donald Trump himself, right? This is an authoritarian movement that has deeply anti-democratic, illiberal tendencies within it, and we have to make that kind of we have to kind of remove Donald Trump from his voters, and so there are similarities with authoritarian movements across the world with Donald Trump. I mean, I point to Hungary today with Viktor Orban. I mean, Donald Trump is part of a right-wing authoritarian movement that is sweeping across the Western world.
Okay.
I can't predict the future, right? And so I don't know if he wins election what 2026 or 2027 will be, but I see a lot. I do see similarities in Trumpism with these anti-democratic, illiberal, authoritarian movements across the Western world. You know, we have to we don't want to be alarmist, right? But we also have to kind of be able to describe what we see in front of our eyes.
Right.
And I hope that makes sense.
It does. And, you know, Chuck, I had to go to, because to the point you made earlier, you know, people are throwing so much stuff against the wall based on how they feel. And when I hear the Hitler comparisons, I'm like, if you want to go there, that's a big, you got to unpack some things that make sense if you want to take it there.
Yeah, and you don't want to make that comparison.
Exactly.
Because that turns off
conversation. And that's why, knowing that you've studied that, I wanted to at least throw it out there to you to see, you know, what you could try to connect for us. And yeah, you answered the question.
On the other hand, what Jeff was saying, I think, speaks to me about looking at authoritarian movements in general and what leads to those movements and to the embrace of particular leaders. One of the things that's really hard to do is to separate Trump from his voters. I mean, this is, you know, there's a part of me that says, I look at Donald Trump and I see a kind of pain and brokenness that leads to the Trump that we see. And I know that there's this broken human being in there somewhere, this little boy longing to be loved and admired. But I know people are going to say pop psychology, but it's what I see. But I also feel like this is one of the most despicable human beings I have ever seen perform on the public stage. And I don't feel that way about a lot of people I know who support him. They're not despicable human beings. And and they will try to make that separation. Well, yeah, he's a bad guy in some ways, but he just might be, if we give him power, he just might be the worst guy we could have in leadership in the American system ever. And so how do we help people to think about that on a big scale so that we're not talking about 5 years from now or 2 years from now, we're not talking about all of the folks who have been deported and all of the folks from the intelligentsia who are in jail because how do we help people to think about these things in a deeper way across the board? Because it's not just the ignorant people on the right who don't think about this very deeply. It's all of us.
Yeah.
So when I bring people to a place where we can actually talk about these things, one of the big obstacles is that we don't know the other. And so something like 65% of white Americans do not know a black person. I mean, they may casually work with one, but they don't have a black friend. 70% of Americans don't know a Muslim, or at least they don't know that they know a Muslim. The numbers of us who don't know people who are not inside our bubble is immense. And so how do we, and we're just kind of trying to live our lives, right? So I get up in the morning, I go to work, I come home, I take my kids to the ball game. I'm trying to make ends meet. I go shopping and food prices are up. And by the end of the day, I think about my kids, my daughters. By the end of the day, they're like, I can't think about anything else. I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed. And then we're asking those people to figure things out.
I gotta add this. I gotta add this, Chuck. I gotta add it as the minority at the table. If you are one of our white brothers and sisters who never interfaces with other, inject whatever race or ethnicity that you'd like, you are putting in this day and age, you are putting your children at a huge disadvantage.
Absolutely right.
I want you to hear this clearly. You are putting your children at a huge disadvantage because all of the other, to include black folks, African Americans, we have to study you to thrive in this country. We grow up learning about you in history books. We grow up learning about you in movies. We are all students of how you, white America, thinks. If we don't understand how white America thinks, we can't pay our bills. We can't move up in this country. We are all students. Our Asian brothers and sisters know you very well. Our Indian brothers and sisters know you very well. And you don't know us very well too often. And you hand that to your children in a world where the most ill-informed person in terms of diversity is now at a disadvantage. I caution you. I caution you.
We not only
Broaden
don't know
your horizons.
We don't know. Not only don't know you, but we don't know ourselves very well.
This is
so
true.
that goes back to what
This
Jeff
is
was
true.
saying about
This
the
is
ability to look in the mirror and actually think about. There's a great line in Bruce Hornsby's song where he talks about the little boy, black boy, who can't go where the others go because he doesn't look like they do.
That's
and
just
then he
the way
says,
it is.
That's just the way it is. But he also says, did you think about it before you made the rules? Did you really think about it? And no, we didn't think about it before we made the rules. The rules have been in place forever. A few people put those rules in place years ago, and then we've done what we need to buttress those rules so that we can keep ourselves, those in the power structure, we can keep ourselves in charge. But then there's those of us who live in that safe bubble beneath those elite who have created the rules, and we can't step back enough to look at the system and say, you know what? There is systemic racism. There is bias against women. And so we just kind of have bought a particular narrative that makes it hard for us to understand the other, instead of sitting down and hearing from the other.
A narrative that people have spent billions to force upon us.
Oh, absolutely.
Makes it easy to buy. But I saw your face when we were breaking all this down. Give us your thoughts, Jeff. Give us your thoughts.
It is mesmerizing to me that it's difficult for many Americans to understand that systemic racism is a reality. You know, I mean, sexism and misogyny is a reality, right? And I always struggle with this, and I think it's about acknowledgement. Is that in a give and take of a conversation, right? People, you know, if I do all the talking, you know, professors are good at that, right? And when I deal with students, I always try to let them speak as well, right? Because that always builds a relationship. And in highly educated America is talks a lot about, as we should, about systemic racism and sexism and misogyny. And I think a lot of Americans would be more receptive to that conversation if we would also include class in that. I mean, and once people, if you say, oh, I hear what you're saying, and you've been wounded too, right? And then I think we would have, you know, more white working class people be more receptive to, you know, men hearing about misogyny and sexism. They have mothers, they have daughters, they hear these stories. But my sense is that, you know, highly educated America, we kind of beat a drum talking about kind of race and gender and even sexual orientation, and those biases are all very real, And I wonder if we also included class, right? If and you would have a whole segment of America that felt like they were heard as well, and they were welcome at that table, right? And then it's a conversation, and then it's not a contest. Too often we make it into a contest, right? Who gets the gold medal in the Oppression Olympics? You know? And like, I'm not interested in that.
Phrase.
Like,
this is true.
Hey, I'm
this
a white
true.
working class guy. I understand that an African American working class person has a much higher hill to climb than I did, right? It's not a contest. I don't, but acknowledgement, right, all the way around. If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And and if people felt listened to and we could acknowledge their struggles, I think you could build. I mean, that's maybe a way in which you undermine some segments of Trumpism, because Trump is speaking to a particular segment of white America, but more and more it's a segment of working class America. I think they don't. I think a lot of working class. I feel the same way because I have working class roots, and I get very frustrated that when whether it's NPR or the BBC or the New York Times, legacy media, I'm when they focus on particular things and not on like the experience of working class Americans, even I get a little bit, my back gets up.
Yeah.
And I think that's a piece that's missing, and then it wouldn't be a contest. Because it's just so obvious that there's systemic racism. It's just so obvious there's systemic sexism.
The second paragraph of this article articulates well a lot of what you're saying now. It says Trumpism lies at the intersection of deaths of despair at the white working class. While this torment has devastated Native American and African American communities for decades, when it hits the nation's single largest voting demographic, the white working class, this death toll literally dragged the entire nation's life expectancy downward. Out of anger and despair, they also put Donald Trump into the White House. Anyone who cares about democracy should heed the deaths of despair reality.
What are define deaths of despair? Because I think it's a term that many people have never even heard.
Rooted in a book.
Yeah, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by two economists. So Deaths of Despair, it is this reality that a wide swath of middle-aged, working-class white Americans are dying early, a generation early. They're dying in their 40s and 50s from drug addiction, alcoholism, risky life choices. And it's such a profound, it's about 200,000 or so white working class Americans every year who are dying 25 years early. And it's such a large number, it's dragged the nation's entire life expectancy downward. This is the only demographic in the entire world, the white working class, that is experiencing this. And I mean, it's interesting because we talk about the white working class and deaths of despair, and I would imagine a lot of working class African Americans are like, oh yeah, we didn't have a term for that. Deindustrialization hit us first.
That's what it
right?
was.
We didn't name it till it happened to white people.
No, absolutely. And now all of a sudden, books are written about it because it happened to white people. Sure, I mean it's a larger demographic, and it's therefore less easy to ignore. But that's the reality, and it's a reality for working class people of all races in America, and it just astounds me that Democratic politicians don't acknowledge it, because if you could acknowledge it, you're not only talking to white people, you're talking to non-whites as well.
You talk about reality. Another line from this article: Pennsylvania's deaths of despair are 50% higher than the national average. Give us the reaction when you first discovered that stat.
Well, my best friend from high school died of deaths of despair last February, and I wrote about it in a national publication, and it sent me on a quest. And I published something in the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And the Cleveland Plain Dealer piece, I focused on the three people in their 30s who. Two of them died at the Tops grocery store last March, so a year ago, and they had taken heroin, laced with fentanyl, and it took 24 hours before somebody noticed there was a minivan idling in the parking lot. And so, I mean, look, where are these deaths of despair? Where do they hit hardest? In places where deindustrialization, meaning the Rust Belt, have hit the hardest. And what's interesting is that is there economic despair? Yes, but it's about loneliness. It's about a lack of community. It's a lack of connection to other people.
Yeah.
That and so it's not just about, well, people had better jobs, magically, we wouldn't have these deaths of despair. And I think that's what Trumpism points to. It's the mirror that we're looking at, is that we have a social recession, in America.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to my father-in-law the other day, and he used to work at Lord's back in the day, and he played on their softball team. And I thought about my Uncle Dennis, who worked at Amsco back in the day, and he played on their softball team, right? And you think about stuff like that, and I remember going to, open gyms with my dad and other parents from other families from Amsco, and the picnics and the beers after work. There was a whole social ecosystem surrounding these great blue-collar jobs. So there were, bowling leagues, and there were all of these intersections where these guys interacted outside of this 9 to 5, and then you remove all of those quote unquote good blue collar jobs, the ecosystem that was connected to those jobs begins to dissipate, because now it's, you play softball for your job. I'm sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
I don't play softball for Erie Insurance or for, whatever. It just doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
Even things like church softball leagues, and where we would, those social connections are so much less existent. We socially connect now through social media, which is not really social connection in the truest sense of that. We're not sitting across a table looking at somebody, seeing their reactions, feeling their pain, looking into their eyes. And so we need to do a lot more on the personal level. I wrestle with this.
This is one of the central problems of the Western left is the materialism, meaning the left can only focus upon how do you improve people's lives by thinking economically.
Right.
And the left does not speak to the spiritual side of people, right? I mean, there's a secularism in the left. In many ways, look, I acknowledge it, I admire it, but humans are more than just economic beings. And the left needs to talk to the spiritual crisis that's afflicting all Americans. What I find amazing is highly educated Americans in urban centers have been able to kind of navigate this world in a way that working class people have been less able to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many, pornography, gambling, marijuana is now legalized. There's so many ways in which, we can be wooed into lifestyles. Yeah. And thus far, kind of highly educated urbanites have been able to kind of surf this very new world with all these different kind of escapist, in what I think is trap doors. And working class people who no longer have these softball leagues, who are less likely to go to church. They're less able to navigate this world.
That's the point. There it is. Yeah. As I think about this, deaths of despair, and you're talking about it, all of this kind of came to mind. It wasn't something I ever gave any thought to until literally in this conversation, because I was one of those kids, right?
Yeah.
I remember, there was a whole lifestyle around my dad working at Amsco.
Yeah. Bowling leagues and softball leagues.
Yeah,
and we went to the Italian Sons and Daughters of America picnic every year. And I mean, my family's very blue collar. My grandfather was a trucker, a teamster organized in Pittsburgh, and my other grandfather, it's all blue collar, north side of Pittsburgh. So I understand that ecosystem and loved being a part of that ecosystem.
And when it's gone.
Yep. And now we're much more isolated. So what do people do when they don't have those systems? They glom onto something like the MAGA movement. And so now I got a place to be. I got an identity. I'm connected. I'm not as isolated and alone. Yeah. Are we saying, by the way, in this conversation, it struck me a few minutes ago that, so we talk about marginalized groups in this culture all the time.
Yeah.
And we talk about that at this table.
Are they one?
Are white working class people one of those now?
I think the article's kind of pointing to the fact that one could frame it as such.
And you're
Absolutely.
smacking your forehead like that's
Yes.
exactly what people do when they're like, "Oh, that guy's doesn't. What is he talking about? How does he not know this?" But this is an enlightening conversation for me that way. Yes.
Yes, I mean, it's not a contest. White working class people are marginalized. And look, I mean, if African American working class are more marginalized.
Yeah.
Like, I'm fine with, like, I just acknowledge reality.
Yes.
I'm a historian. I have eyes.
Yeah.
You know, we can see these things. But, you know, in academia, like, to say that white working class people are marginalized, I'd get laughed. I mean, I make these arguments in the papers that I write, in the books that I write, and I get a lot of angry pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's just central to their ideology that, you know, that people have a hard time kind of thinking in this way because, you know, the history of racism in America is just so profoundly bad, you know, but it's not and we need to quit thinking about it. It is not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
For me to see the pain of a white working class person in Erie does not mean that I am less likely to see the pain of a working class African American or a new American. And I don't understand, you know, why that's so threatening to people on the left, and it is very threatening to people on the left.
Yeah.
And it's on issue after issue.
It is.
We
It
were
is.
talking about
It is.
Israel Palestine not too long ago, and one of the things I said is, and if you do nuance, it's not an art that's encouraged these days to think in grays, to think in nuance. It's black and white. Choose a side, buddy. But I look at that situation and I see people dying in Gaza who have no responsibility for what's happened there, and I see Israel dealing with thousands of years of anti-Semitism, and can't I be sympathetic and empathetic to
Amen.
folks on both sides without being labeled as out of touch or an idiot or wishy-washy or whatever the terms might be? I think we're moving in a direction, and this is the positive thing for me that has happened as a result of Donald Trump. We are beginning to pay attention to issues that we didn't before. More and more of us are being thoughtful about the nature of our democracy, about the future of our world, about how we relate to one another. And I mean, Donald Trump just kind of brings together all the ills of society in one nice little package, one nice little orange package. And we don't. I'm not sure if without him we would have been forced into this.
It goes back to Dr. King, you know, racism, militarism, poverty, capitalism. These are things that he railed against repeatedly. These were some of the things, militarism and racism, were some of the impetus behind his Beyond Vietnam speech, which again got him excoriated. You know, it's empathizing with humanity, right? It goes back to what you're saying about this is not a contest. And in his mind, and we've spoken about that at great length about Dr. King, because even when you go back to his father with, you know, him following Martin Luther's work and changing his name and, you know, and then Dr. King adopting the work of Gandhi. This is anything but a black thing when you really unpack Dr. King's legacy. But simply put, it's not a competition. And that's the way he lived. Yeah. As we head to the finish line, Jeff, we'll give you some of the last words. This has been a wonderful interview. Give us something to leave on.
There's no pressure, Jeff.
No pressure,
but please solve the problem for us.
Right.
Give us the prescription.
And whatever you say needs to change everybody's lives. So parse your words carefully.
At least until we walk out of here, because Marcus and I do this at the coffee shop every month, and then we walk out into the real world. But what are your thoughts about?
I guess I'm thinking about Dr. King because he, you know, sadly on the left, he's out of fashion, which depresses me to no end. I mean, it's not a contest. We can have we can read our Ibram Kendis, but also read our Dr. Kings. And I think of what, for myself as someone from the South, as a white Southerner, you know, what King did is not only you know, in Jim Crow and segregation, and not racism in America, but Jim Crow and segregation. What he did is he released white Americans, and he talked about this, from the prison of Jim Crow and segregation and white supremacy.
That's another show, Jeff. That's good stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, and what it it's always depressed me in class when I teach about the civil rights movement. I brought Diane Nash to campus a few years ago, right? And John Lewis, I got to meet John Lewis when he came to Erie, and those were always my idols, always my idols. And for many white students, they don't see the civil rights movement as belonging to them. And I'm like, oh my goodness, these are Americans. This is our movement. This belongs to all of us. It's not a contest, right? I mean, this was never what King preached, right? This was not what the beloved community belongs to all of us.
Absolutely right.
And, the Poor People's March, right? I mean, that was King. And we diminish that legacy by only thinking of it as an African-American movement.
That's right.
Right? And white working class people belong at that table as well. This is our movement. King belongs primarily to the African-American community, right? But he also belongs to me.
That's right.
And I think sometimes this is what the American left needs to recapture, is the idealism of such a unifying figure such as Martin Luther King. And that's what, that talking about King, that's those are my closing thoughts.
Yeah. I'll read something that you already touched on to close. It's one of the paragraphs from this article. Again, it says Donald Trump is the least popular politician in America. He is a one-man indictment machine who accomplished exactly nothing as president. Yet, Democrats struggle to beat him. And the working class flocks to him. That is the real story.
It is.
Jeff Bloodworth, this has been a wonderful, wonderful interview. Chuck, thank you for bringing it together.
Absolutely. It was great.
Yeah. And listen,
I think he should become like a regular. We'd do a monthly thing. His wife is also incredible.
He's on the list. My favorite Gannon professor, who was on my show for the barbershop, is the good doctor, Dr. Paris Baker.
Right?
The two of them
We
together.
have got to bring you two on the show together.
Paris and I talk about we have common Mississippi roots, right?
Marcus has some Mississippi in him too.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of that going on. This has been great. This has been very educational. And again, reading your article, it really makes people think, and that's always the goal. I mean, we joke about solving the world's problem, but in reality, the goal, and I tell people up front, if I can make you at least say, let me give that some thought, that's a win. Nobody's trying to change your ideology in this conversation. At the very least, I want you to come to the realization that it's not that simple. Can you at least just think about it?
We will, in the show notes, we will include a link to the article in the Erie Reader. But if you just Google the Erie Reader and look for Jeff's name, Bloodworth, you will find this article, which is terrific.
And you can follow him on Twitter X at jhueybloodworth, or reach him at Bloodworth, Bloodwar, WOROO3 at gannon.edu. And so that's his contact information. And thank you all so much for tuning in. That's it for our show today. You can come in next time and listen to more discussion and analysis with local and national guests. I want you to remember that Next 2.0 streams on Fridays on all major podcast platforms and on the fourth Sunday of the month at 4 p.m. on WQLN PBS NPR, which is 91.3 FM. Again, if you want to leave a message, comment, or suggestion for the show, you can call the Next hotline at 814-240-8816, 814-240-8816. We look forward to hearing from you. I am Marcus Atkinson. Join us again so that you can hear more about what's next for our communities and our democracy. Peace.